Hey everybody, it's Corporal Speculation, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a political fallacy that I've been watching and thinking about for years, and I'm going to attempt to put it into words, and I'm going to call that the survival fallacy. And basically, it's based on the idea of I don't know if you know this story, but during World War II, there would be a lot of planes that would come back with bullet holes all over them. And so they started looking at where the bullet holes were hitting and thinking that these are probably the places that, planes are most likely to get hit. So they jacked up the armor for those particular areas. And they noticed that it didn't really seem to have much of an impact. They started adding more and more armor to the planes in the areas that they're out there getting hit. And the planes are still going down at the exact same rate. So not really sure why this is happening. And it took a very intelligent man, Ward was his name, and he saw that, or he said, well, what about the ones that don't come back? And they realized what it was is they were actually armoring up the parts of the plane that when they got shot, the plane would survive, and they were not armoring up the parts of the plane that, if they did get shot, they wouldn't survive. So they were doing exactly the opposite of what they should have been doing. And it's just kind of an interesting, story that gets thrown out a lot and really kind of got me thinking about, why modern politics is so toxic and also so ineffective. And I think a big part of the reason is because, we love to hone in and focus on what's not really working well, because then people start talking about taking that thing away or abolishing it or reworking it. And that kind of scares people. And then once people are a little bit scared, they kind of don't want to continue the conversation. So it turns into a shouting match, and then the conversation goes nowhere. Maybe they do get rid of the thing. Maybe they don't. Chances are they don't, because it is hard to get rid of things. And so, the conversation becomes focused around, programs that aren't necessarily working super well and have a lot of criticism about. It's kind of the same as, maybe if a certain race gets killed by a police officer versus if that person of that same race gets killed by someone else of the same race. And it's like, which is more likely to garner national headlines? And it's like, okay, well, why? And the reason why is because, there's a lot of people that are going to come out and defend the police officer. And then there's a lot of people who are going to come out and defend the person who was shot. And now you're having an argument and people get dug in. That drives engagement. So we talk more about it. And then people get even more dug in. And it's a big national conversation. And that's why we're talking about one and not the other. When the ultimate impact is that there was a loss of life in both stories, but it's what gets focused on, what do we look into more? And I think something similar is happening with our politics, but almost reversed, in that we're not really talking about the stuff that we do well, So I want to talk a little bit about, things that I think that we are crushing. As an example, in the United States, I always like to say we have a perfect healthcare system. I know. Give me just a few seconds. Okay, let me explain it. It's the over-the-counter pharmaceutical market, right? Not the one you're thinking about, right? Because nobody ever thinks about the over-the-counter pharmaceutical market. Why not? Because it works well, right? Because if you need aspirin, you go get aspirin. You can have it DoorDash to your house. Your stomach hurts, you can go get some Pepto-Bismol, no problem. Maybe you keep some Tums on hand, so that way if you ever have heartburn, it's not an issue. You go ahead and go get that taken care of. You have an iron deficiency? Well, you can go right to Walgreens and grab some gummies. That'll taste super good. And you can get the iron ones, you can get the zinc ones, magnesium, you get a multivitamin. Anything that you need is there. You got a flu, grab some NyQuil. Grab some Tamiflu. These things are all pretty inexpensive. They're not on the market long before generic comes out. And it's a well-run healthcare system that works really well and covers costs super well. Let's think about that. Let's really give that an honest think. And then, continuing along, that line of logic of sectors that are working really well, let's think about food stamps. You know, right now the government is shut down over the the ACA subsidies. What are those? Those are a $350 billion direct payment to insurance companies to lower the cost of healthcare. Does this really feel like it's working out well? I mean, it's just another bailout, right? Food stamps cost about $100 billion a year and have basically eradicated food scarcity in the United States of America, right? So for this one small bill that we're arguing about is basically we're talking about 1/3 of the budget for 10 years of food stamps, you know? Well, if I'm a liberal, if I'm on the left, maybe I look at food stamps and I think, well, this seems like a good way to make sure that people aren't going without in my society. Just something to consider, right? Think about what's working. And I think as somebody who's a little bit more conservative, I don't like arguing food stamps. That's not fun for me. You know, I have to argue that we have to get rid of this program because it makes me uncomfortable to see people, you know, buying too much food in the supermarket, even though $100 billion of our multi-trillion-dollar budget is pennies. And then it's really resolving a problem that, you know, if we didn't have any food, that would become the number one issue very quickly, you know? So if you're like a healthcare is a human right type of person, well, then you'd probably be a food is a human's right type of person if there was more food scarcity, right? You know, I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. It's not a hard counterfactual to run in your head. You know, another great example of a voucher system that's working really well. How about the Pell Grant? You know, I was poor when I graduated high school. And when I got out of the Marine Corps, I certainly wasn't doing very well for a few years there. I'm doing much better now. Thanks for asking. But, you know, back in the day, I was not doing super well. So I went and applied for college at a community college and got a Pell Grant that cut me a check to cover my courses, you know. And I went in and I got you know, that taken care of. My tuition was taken care of, and I was able to get all of my books used, creating downward pressure on pricing, because I went for the cheaper option, which that creates a pricing signal. You know, you want to maintain cheap products. Well, people have to make the decision to buy the cheaper versions then, right? You know, so I'm sending positive buying signals to the schools that they need to cut their costs, right? And then I had a little bit left over, which I know some people don't love that because I spent the money on beer. But, you know, I had a little bit of cash left over, so I took the money, you know, and, you know, that's why, thanks to the Pell Grant, community colleges are pretty cheap, you know, and if you gave me that money and the community college I wanted to go to was $10,000, but there was another one that was $2,000 for a semester, I'd go to the cheaper one. Right? Because I have this money for this purpose. I'm going to use it for that. You know, that creates downward pressure on pricing. So that's why the Pell Grant is a really good social program that's working really well and should be championed more. You know, but why isn't it? You ever think about that? Why isn't it? Well, not ever, but are you thinking about it now? And I think the reason is because there's just not much debate around it, right? Nobody's going out and saying, let's kill the Pell Grant. You know, food stamps are cut off right now, but you never see any serious legislation or talk about getting rid of it because these are well-run social programs, right? So doesn't it make sense to take what's working well, right, and then try and apply it to more places? Like, what would a healthcare system look like if it was voucherized? You know, how could you help out just the ones who need it the most, but then still control for costs and not have this rampant inflation? It's tough to put the genie back in the bottle at this point because it's been broken for as long as it has, but it's absolutely something worth considering. And you compare the Pell Grant system to, you know, state colleges where it's X10 the cost, you know, it's clear that the Pell Grant system is working a lot better than the student loan system, you know? So let's compare these things, you know, instead of arguing and debating fiercely over whether we should forgive student loans. Why don't we talk a little bit about how much better the Pell Grant's going than student loans, how it's a way smaller burden on taxpayers, but it still accomplishes the same thing while controlling for costs, you know? But again, it just doesn't really come up, you know? And there's a lot of issues like that, where it's just going fairly well, and so there's not a lot of conversation about it, but a lot of things that you look around and you take for granted, if there wasn't a lot of them, and then people started making the argument they should be universal and free, some people would buy that. It just kind of is what it is. If the government provided all of your shoes, and then somebody said, oh, well, maybe we should privatize or voucherize, the shoes, so that way companies can make shoes and we can buy whatever shoes we want. People would say, what are you talking about? People need shoes. Shoes should universal right. Everybody should have shoes. If people don't have shoes, then it is what it is. We're going to be in trouble, right? But you go out into the market today, and there's thousands and thousands of options for shoes. People have shoes, and healthcare existed in the market, and education existed in the market before all of these social programs. So they could still be provided at a rate that's profitable for both the consumer and for the provider. So that's just kind of what I want you guys to think about, is like, and hit me with a comment. I'm interested. I know that there's tons and tons more. These are just the quick examples I pulled off the top of my head, but of well-running sectors or government programs that are being run at low cost and providing a lot of good, and then maybe how could we, kick that out to more sectors, or, what private sectors do you think are working particularly well? I'm just interested in what you guys have to say. So hit me with a comment, a like, a subscribe, and let's stop patching up the parts of the plane that don't need to be patched up. Let's start having debates that people don't want to have because they're not super interesting, because everybody kind of agrees, and taking the policies that work and trying to make them more universal, kick them out to more stuff. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great day.